Jess Moody is a pastor in Florida. He one time was looking for a secluded spot in his church to work on his sermon. And it's one of those large churches that has a large sound booth that is usually surrounded on all sides so not to distract attention during the worship service. So he decided that he would go in there, lay out his papers, and just kind of sit down and do some work. Well, as he was sitting in the sound booth, a couple of youth came into the sanctuary. And one of them said, "Why don't you go up into the pulpit where that blankety-blank preacher gives his sermon?" And the other one said, "Yeah, and ask those blankety-blank deacons to take up an offering so we can buy a new car." Well, as you imagine, Pastor Moody was horrified. He couldn't believe it. Here were these boys speaking like a drunken sailor right in this beautiful chapel. Then he remembered, hey, I'm in the sound booth. So he kind of quietly reached over and turned the sound booth on, turned the speakers way up, and then when he waited for the right moment, he says, "I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me." And with that, Jess Moody says, you should have seen their faces. They tucked their tails and ran, and all I saw were two shirt tails flying around the corner of the building. Then he adds with tongue in cheek, "Those boys are now in the mission field having heard the call of God that night." "No, not really," he said. "I might have to try that for a lock-in one of these times." Some of you probably have seen these billboards that have been around the country. They haven't seen them so much lately, but they're pretty simple. They look like this. They're on either a white or black background. And so you see kind of these simple words. There's some that will say things like, "Don't make me come down there, God." Other ones, "Let's meet at my house Sunday before the game." "What part of thou shalt not didn't you understand?" Or, "We need to talk, God." "That love thy neighbor thing, I meant it." And then, "You think it's hot here?" Question mark. Now, I don't know if it's made a difference, but I like where the message is going. Especially that first one that I shared with you. "Don't make me come down there." Kind of sounds like a parent that is ready to take care of his unruly kids. As we hear this passage, it's going to be read by Sam and Macy's mom, Laura. I want you to listen to how Jesus has gotten us into the idea that God needs to come down here and teach us the right way to live.
From the 18th chapter of Luke. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to teach them that they should always pray and should never become discouraged. In a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected man. And there was a widow in that same town who kept coming to him, pleading for her rights, saying, "Help me against my opponent." For a long time the judge refused to act. But at last he said to himself, "Even though I don't fear God or respect man, yet because all of the trouble this widow is giving me, I will see to it that she gets her rights. If I don't, she will keep on coming and finally wear me out." And then the Lord continued, "Listen to what the corrupt judge said. Now will God not judge in favor of his own people who cry to him day and night for help? Will he be slow to help them? I tell you, he will judge in their favor and do it quickly. But will the Son of Man find faith on earth when he comes?"
Thank you, Lord. This passage is about not giving up. This passage is about persistence in prayer. But it's more than that. It's about God's justice. It is about God's plan for humanity. About how we're supposed to treat each other. About what it means to be in relationship with each other. Something that I think that we need so much right now. As a son and daughter of God, it is our job, I believe, to share in this responsibility. And that means making justice real and alive. And something that I believe God recognizes. Ed Marquardt is a pastor in Seattle. He tells a story about two brothers. He says their names were Billy and Bobby. The story will sound familiar to many of us because it is lived out in so many relationships we see around us. Billy, the older brother, has everything going for him. He is smart, popular, athletic, handsome, and he is always in charge at home. What he says goes. Bobby, on the other hand, does not receive the blessings that we assume make for a happy life. He is mildly handicapped, shy, not athletic. Nothing comes easily for Bobby. Bobby always lives in the shadow of his brother's successes. One day, the boy's mother makes 3 cinnamon rolls for breakfast. This is the boy's favorite treat. They each have 1 roll, but it's not enough to satisfy their craving. When Mom steps out of the room, Billy announces that he is taking the last cinnamon roll. He is older and smarter and gets to choose. And so he snatches the roll off the plate and devours it in front of his disappointed little brother. This goes on day after day after day. And Bobby becomes more and more frustrated. Now, before we go on, Pastor Marquardt says, let's get one thing straight. Billy is not a bad person. He is not out to hurt his brother. He is like all of us, determined to look out for number 1. So focused on our own fulfillment that we don't notice the injustices we leave in our wake. Billy used his age and strength to get what he wanted without looking out for the needs of his weaker brother. But the boy's mother soon became wise to the situation. She knows that it is important to treat both boys fairly. She also understands that sometimes the Bobbies of this world need to be protected from the Billies. So the next time she cuts the 3rd cinnamon roll in half and gives 1/2 to each of the boys. She ensures that they are both treated equally and that no resentment or aggression springs up between them. Likewise, Pastor Marquardt says, with God. God is just. God's will is that the Bobbies of life will be protected from the Billies of life. I think that's why I resonate with this passage. I feel so strongly about the words that were shared by Laura here this morning that sometimes I feel like I need to take a step back. I think that's how many of us feel when we find a passage that we strongly relate to. I have visited with people that have gone in the ministry, and they tell me that there is this passage in Isaiah of when Isaiah was called into the ministry. It is a vivid passage. It is a beautiful passage about how God called Isaiah to ministry. And these people tell me that when they read that passage, they resonate with it more than any other. I've also talked with women that so appreciate the stories of Jesus and how he includes women into his inner circle. And they tell me that those passages in the gospel speaks to them and their inner core. I one time heard an African-American preacher that talked about the Old Testament. And he's talked about how when he lifts up the patriarchs and the prophets, people that he would say are not perfect people. He says that people resonate in his congregation. People like the family that sells their brother into slavery. Or the dad who offers his son up as a sacrifice. Or the other who steals his brother's birthright. Or a mom who helps his son or son cheat their dad. This African-American preacher told us that when he shares that text with his congregation, there are people in his church that can relate and understand each and every person that is lifted up. I think that's the way it is for each of us. When we find a Bible passage, or maybe 2, that speaks to us that we're in the situation that we're in. Now, as I said to you, today's passage speaks volumes to me. But I do have to say, I realize that I'm not in the same position as this woman. In fact, if this woman was playing baseball, she would have 3 strikes already against her even before she got up to the plate. 1, she's a woman. Women were expected to know their place in the biblical society. And this woman, she has to make her own place. 2, she's a widow. Her status disappeared when her husband died. There was nobody to advocate for her. And 3, she is poor. Her opponent is a judge who neither fears God nor respects people. All he is motivated is by money, and she has nothing. Now, I just told you I am not in her position. But I do feel for her. She is bullied. She is put in an unfair situation. She is powerless to a judge who uses his position to take advantage of her. I do not have 3 strikes against me, but I do know how it feels to be bullied. Lauren and I share something in common. It is the church in Douglas. This is the church that my father served, and also Lauren helped build after that fire so many years ago. We both have fond memories of that church there in Douglas, Nebraska. But unfortunately, that is where our similarities end. Because when I think back to my schooling in Douglas, it was not a place of refuge like that church was. When I think back to my time in school in Douglas, I can still see the faces of Shannon and Daniel and David. People whose memory and names I will never forget. When I read this passage, I hear the games people play. And I'm not talking about being on the playground where you're constantly picked last. Or I'm not talking about those hidden out places where the teacher doesn't see you so you can have the little sucker punch. I'm talking about the games that persist into adulthood. About those times that coworkers ignore you because your boss chose you over a project that they thought they should have been chosen. Or when you were threatened with a lawsuit just so you're intimidated. It happens too often when people slowly drive by someone's house repeatedly, especially after sending an abusive text. It continues through messages to your friends as they're trying to isolate you. As we have shared in this sermon series, games can be for good. It is how we learn from life, but the games we play do have a dark side. It is used in unhealthy ways to promote physical, mental, and emotional abuse. As one might imagine, these are the games that are not played by God's rules. There's a story about a man who was stopped by St. Peter as he was going into the pearly gates. St. Peter told him, "Hey, not so fast. We have a new policy here. You need to tell us about a good deed that you did." And so the man says, "Well, I've done a good deed. I once saw a gang of skinhead bikers picking on a little old lady. I went up to their leader and I said, you ought to pick on someone your own size. And I hit him in the stomach and then I kicked over his heartling." St. Peter was quite impressed. He says, "That is a good deed. When did you do this?" And the guy says, "About 3 minutes ago." I'll be honest with you. I struggled with this sermon. I'm not one to bring up my past, my being bullied, my being picked on, my being treated differently because who I was. Coming up with these words were not easy. And so I resonate with a woman who was treated unfairly. I resonate with how easily she was taken advantage of by someone who was more powerful. And I tell you, when I read this passage, there's just kind of that ounce of me of remembering back what life was like that just kind of boils inside of me. And then I'm reminded of something, of what occurs next. Life doesn't stop when you're a victim. God doesn't walk away when you've been mistreated. Jesus reminds us that this is not the way it is supposed to be. God has a different set of rules for the world to play by. What's that old cliche? When life hands you lemons, you make lemonade. In other words, you stand up, you do something, and you fight for justice. There's a story about a young black man who was asking his preacher one day why people suffer so much poverty and hardship and oppression. "Why doesn't God do something?" he said to his pastor. And his pastor just says, "He has. God has created you." And Archbishop Desmond Tutu says that's how he got his calling into the ministry. God has called you to do something about it. We need to hear this, I think, today. This is a lesson for all of us because we all play the game. We can all sit and wait for God to create this perfect and ideal just society, or we can be God's answer for injustice in the world. And that's what it means by taking up the cross and following Jesus. But it's not going to be comfortable. We're going to lose friends on Facebook over it, but it is the way of the cross. I want to introduce you to Wits and Wagers. Now, this is a game that I am guessing is probably not in the Ekdahl household. The reason why is because you wager some bets. There's some gambling here, just if you didn't figure that out, Lauren. Okay, no. One time, thank you, Lord. This is how the game works. You pick out a category, and then someone reads the question on there, and then you write down the answer. But before the correct answer is read, everyone has to show their answers. And before I forget, all the answers have to be in numbers. It might be like, what was the year the Constitution was signed, or a certain percentage, or the answer is something that's a number. And that's important because all the cards have to be laid out in numerical order, from least to greatest. Now, before the answer is read, this is where the Wits and Wagers comes in. As you're looking at all these answers on this board, you're trying to decide, okay, which one is the best answer? And it doesn't even have to be the answer that you have. And so what you do is you're looking at the answers and you put down 1 or 2 tokens, or however many tokens you've earned at that point, and then the answer is read. Now, here's the part, before we get to the answer, here's the part where the wit comes in. Say that you don't know the answer. You have no idea what the answer is, but you're a really good bluffer. And so you're, with all confidence, put down your answer, and it looks pretty good. And so everyone else is looking at all of them, and your answer might be wrong, but everyone has just waged on you, and so thus you've won, because you've outwitted everyone else. That's what I like about this game. All you need to do, even if you don't know the answer, is just outwit your opponent. Now, we've learned a lot about games in this sermon series. We've talked about Simon Says and Uno and Wits and Wagers. Oh, and one of the things I want to mention here, this is not Simon Says. This is a complicated game. This is a game for adults. You need to know some understanding of world events to kind of help you. But also what I like about it, there's no bullying. There's no physical activity. There is no stacking up hotels to drive your opponent into bankruptcy. There is no previous skill that you need, such as in basketball or how to throw a baseball. Even if you don't know the answer well, guess what? You can do pretty well. Well, as I said, we've learned about some games here. We've learned about Simon Says, we've learned about Uno, we've learned about Wits and Wagers, and each of these games has a lesson about God. Simon Says was about trusting God. Uno was about, we are the one, we need to be the example to show others gratitude. And today is about not giving up. Because another thing that I like about this game, you never lose the 2 chips that you got at the beginning of the game. You're never out. You continue to go on. So in this game, there will be, no matter what, there will be another day. There will be another round. There will be another opportunity. And when that happens, you just use your wits. Now just look at the woman in our text today. She had 3 strikes against her. She could have gone home. She could have sighed and said to herself, this is it. It will never get better. I will never get justice. But she didn't. She stood up to a bully, and she wore him down. Here's our lesson from Jesus. Outwit, outlast, and continue to fight for justice. There was a tent evangelist who was very successful. He was charismatic. He was a good man. And after a particularly really night of a revival meeting, he was in the tent kind of counting up all the offerings. Just as he was finishing and he put all the offerings into a cloth bag, a man was sent into his tent office. And as they spoke, the man's despair was obvious. He and his family had left their place looking for a job. but nothing was working out. They were now spending the last 2 nights in the car, and they were completely broke. They had no money. They were trying to figure out what to do. But the pastor knew what to do. And so he said, let us kneel and pray. And they did. They prayed for help and salvation and grace and comfort. And when the prayer was over, the pastor opened his eyes, and there was directly in front of him that cloth bag of money. And so the pastor looked at that bag of money and says, okay, let's pray some more. And off they went, praying deeper and longer and more powerfully, calling on the saints and the angels to help this man. And when the prayer was complete, the pastor opened his eyes, and there was the bag of money. And the pastor said, let's really pray this time. And pray they did, passionately, begging and cajoling, pleading for a sign of hope for this young man and his hungry, destitute family. After the prayer was done, there once again, as they opened their eyes, was the bag of money, still sitting silently by. Finally, the pastor picked up the bag, passed it to the man, and bid him farewell. Jesus' message is pretty clear. The game of life can get ugly. There are opportunities that don't seem fair. But don't give up. Use your wits and always demand for something better for you and for God's people. Amen. At this time, we're going to ask the ushers to wait upon us.